Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and speak to you. I spoke to you last January as well about the wage gap in Idaho, and today I'd like to touch on that as well, but primarily I'd like to talk about the personal property tax exemption proposition that's being debated in the legislature. I have a lot of slides, I have a lot of numbers, I have a lot of figures, so it may be slight overload of information on this thing. The problem is it's complicated and it's important, and it's very symbolic of a greater set of dynamics taking place in the state. So I think if you understand the dynamics associated with the personal property tax, it will give you insight into what's happening in the state currently and what has taken place in the past and what you would have to do to change it in the future. That's the direction I'd hope this conversation will go anyway. So let's begin with the problem. The problem was stated in Governor Otter's 2013 State of the State address when he talked about eliminating Idaho's personal property tax, in which he said, eliminating the personal property tax, which nearly everyone agrees is an unfair drag on our economy. I don't agree with that. Personal property tax receipts are a significant part of how some counties pay for public services. They're a very important part, as it turns out. Almost a majority of the taxes come from operating property in some counties. And that it isn't necessary about using state revenues to make counties whole. So it sounds like the governor is willing to cut taxes that counties, cities, and school districts use, but apparently the state doesn't feel any obligation to replace it. So this is a problem, and then he ends by saying, I look forward to hearing your debate and considering your alternatives, and that's what I'd like to do tonight. The information in this study is largely from the Idaho Tax Commission analysis of personal property tax revenues that Alan Dornfist did in December and earlier this month. Local governments primarily have property taxes to fund local services, and the total amount of personal property tax in Idaho used to fund local services is about $1.5 billion. That's on real estate, buildings, and personal property. That's the whole ball of wax. The part of it that I'm going to be referring to in particular is the personal property tax. And it gets confusing because the personal property tax actually has two different components. One is the personal property tax that's assessed at the local level, and then there's a personal property tax that's assessed at the state level. I'm going to be focusing most of my remarks at the personal property tax assessed at the state level, and that is called operating property. Okay, the property tax that's assessed at the local level is called personal property. So it gets quite confusing because what's personal property includes both operating and personal property, but personal property is often just referring to the local assessed part of it. I'm going to try to be as clear about this as I can as we go along, but just know that there's a confusing set of names that go along with this. What I would also point out is that personal property as a proportion of total property tax raised is about 10%. And about 70% of that 10% is assessed locally on personal property, and about 3% or 30% of the personal property is assessed at the state level. Okay, so the operating property portion is about $42 million worth of property tax revenues that come into the local government. The other 70% of personal property is assessed locally. So and the other thing I would point out is that this money goes to county government, cities, schools, all other local services, of which there are many, and then urban renewal. There is tax increment financing is part of urban renewal, and that's also based on property tax. So these are the fundamental revenues that are used for local government. The revenues and the services that people like the most are paid for by property tax. So when you fiddle with any kind of property tax, including personal property, you're affecting the services that people depend on day to day and typically like the best. What is personal property assessed locally? Here's a list of locally assessed personal property categories on taxable items by order of importance. The first category that's most important is other miscellaneous machinery and equipment. And you can think of this as the machines that are inside manufacturing firms. So you can think of this category as the personal property tax on manufacturing. That would be one way to think about it, I think, as a shorthand. And then furnitures and fixtures is the second largest assessed locally. And that is, you might think, it sounds like somebody's coming in and assessing your couch. That's not true. Household items are not assessed in this category. But what this category represents, at least in my view, is retail, the shelving and the refrigeration and the items for display that you'll see in stores around the state. That's what's in this category. So that's essentially retail wholesale category. And then the others are a little more straightforward. You can see construction would be in construction. Mining would be in mining. Utilities is a unusual category for this one. That's mostly an operating property. And then you have miscellaneous. But the large ones are the equipment you find in manufacturing, the equipment you find in retail, and then construction and mining. Those are the main ones. And those are assessed locally. So your local county assessor has responsibility for determining the price of these items. Okay, the state assesses essentially utilities and railroads operating property. So this would be rolling stock for railroads. This would be generation plants for electricity, generators themselves. This would be transmission lines for gas distribution. These are very big items. They're assessed by the state because they cross county lines, and in order to have uniform assessment across county lines, the state does it. So the assessment of utilities and for railroads is done by the state. And you can see that the largest amount of operating property actually comes from electric utilities, followed by railroads, and then telecommunications, and then gas distribution. So when you're talking about giving a property tax break to, in Idaho, essentially you're talking about giving railroads and utilities a property tax break, a very large one, as it turns out, for individuals. This is a very interesting slide because operating property distribution of taxes paid is the most skewed data set I have ever seen. And a skewed data set means that there are lots and lots and lots of small utilities that pay very little operating property, and there are just a handful of very large utilities that pay almost all of it. And this is the problem, in a nutshell, it seems to me, with exempting personal property, and particularly operating property in Idaho. These 21 firms, utilities and railroads, represent 90% of all the operating property in the state of Idaho. Let me say that one more time. These 21 utilities and railroads represent 90% of all operating property. So there are about 400 firms that pay operating property. These 20, just a smidgen, pay almost all of it. So you could allow the other, 380 firms pay zero, and you would still collect 90% of the operating property. That's how skewed this data is. Now, I went through a exercise several years ago asking, because this has been debated for a long time, what if you took personal property off the tax rolls? What effect would it have on the economy? So I didn't know how much they were going to take, half or a third or all of it. So I hit on a number of 45 million, which is about a third of the personal property tax that's currently taxed in Idaho. So if we took a third of it off, so you could scale it up. You could multiply these numbers by 3 to see if you took it all off. But let's just look at these. If you just took a third off, who would be the winners and losers? Well, not surprisingly, utilities, since they pay a very large proportion of it, would be a very large winner in this, followed by manufacturing and retail and wholesale trade. Government would be a big loser, not surprisingly, because you're taking it away from local government. And if for a $45 million decrease in taxes, you would actually have about a $90 million increase in state gross product. So it's about a 2-to-1 ratio. So that's not bad. And you would get about $45,000 per job increase, which we're going to see next. Okay. What jobs are generated by this $45 million decrease in local government revenue? Well, not very many utility jobs. And that's not too surprising because utility is primarily capital. There's not very much labor associated with utilities. They're very big dams and generators associated with it. And so we have the electrical workers in here. They would know a lot more about this than I do, but it's essentially once you have it in place, it pretty much runs itself. It's capital. So if you gave them more money, they would spend it on capital. They wouldn't necessarily spend it on jobs, and you can see it here. Not very many jobs are generated in utilities, even though they got the lion's share of the revenue associated with the tax decrease. The next would be manufacturing, and then wholesale and retail trade. Government would lose 500 jobs. That's a very important figure, because essentially you would be substituting private sector jobs for public sector jobs. And then the question is, what's the right balance between those two? Okay, thank you. And then the money that goes to firms goes back to households, and what this figure shows is that most of the revenue, most of the return on this tax decrease goes to high-income households that are not renters. So not only does it go to a few industries, in particular utilities, it also goes into high-income households. So it's quite regressive in that sense. Okay, you can see that somebody making $150,000 or above makes, 10 times more return from that decrease in taxes than somebody making $10,000 to $15,000. So it's a regressive distribution. Okay, this is where the three-part bill comes in. What are you giving up when you cut local services? Remember, 500 government jobs go away. So what's the effect of that, and why is it important? This is where talking about the wage gap kicks in.